Hi everyone, my name is Taylor and I work in marketing here at Random House. Today we have a writer's routine series and I will be joined shortly by Katie Arnold, who is the author of Running Home. While we wait for Katie to join us, I'm going to quickly pin a comment to the top here so those who tune in later will know what we're talking about, and then we'll get Katie up here with us. Hi.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good, how are you?
I'm great. Good to see you.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks
So
for
for those
having
of you who just joined, this is Katie Arnold, who's the author of Running Home, which was just released in paperback, I believe.
That's right. Just a few weeks ago.
Amazing. Well, congrats on the paperback launch. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your book?
Yeah, sure. So Running Home is my story about my journey through losing my father. He died 10 years ago. And after he died, I had this intense grief experience that turned into anxiety, and I was certain that I was dying too. And I live in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where there's healers of every kind on every street corner, and I tried many of them. And the thing that worked the best for me was what had always worked, which was running. And I've always been a runner since I was a young girl. And so I just started running alone into the wilderness, into the mountains, as a way to feel connected to something larger than myself and the natural world, and to move beyond that worry mind into kind of moving meditation where I was free of the anxiety for a little while. And so I ran through that grief and that anxiety and kind of out the other side, and realized I was curious to know what more my body could do. And so I began running ultra distance trail races and up to 100 miles. And so the book is really my story of that journey, but it's also really a father-daughter story. And father had been, and there were things about him that I hadn't known. And so I was discovering who he was, and by extension, who I was. And yeah, there were lots of sort of painful discoveries, which I reveal in the book. But
Yeah.
ultimately, it was just a beautiful experience in sort of knowing yourself, and seeing that my father had really known himself truly and made choices that were hard, but were from that centered place.
Definitely. Well, your story it's so incredible. There've already been a lot of comparisons to Ages for Hawk and Wild, really hitting that moment of inspiration. And so I'm curious about what made you want to turn this kind of both painful but also big learning experience into a memoir, and what that process was like for you.
It was a really natural process. It was much like running. I showed up every day for the running, and I had no idea for a couple of years that I was really writing this book. But when you run, and if you're an athlete of any kind, or if you do anything that puts you into that flow state where you're thinking but not thinking, and your imagination can turn, you see connections that you don't usually see when we're in our world with like our phone right here or our to-do list. And so I would go out on these runs, and I knew something was working in me, like a story was for me. I've been a writer my whole life, but I didn't know what it would be. And so I just ran, and early on I was in the grief, so you can't see the way forward. So nothing about this was premeditated, but it was really just going out every day and running, and experience, seeing my mind, like learning who I was through running. And I keep notebooks, so I write notes, fill my notebooks with whatever I'm thinking. I filled them with accounts of my father's dying because I wanted to remember. And so it was only like a couple of years after he died that I realized that this whole time I'd been writing in my notebooks and running, that I'd really been writing this book. And so once I saw that, it started to flow out more naturally onto the screen. But I have dozens of these, and the beauty of them is that I was never writing the book, right? When I was writing the book, I was just trying to capture my life. And that's really what my father, who was a photographer for National Geographic, taught me throughout my whole life, was to pay attention and to be an observer, and to capture those moments that so many of us miss. And that's what photographers do so well. And his medium was photographs and mine was words. And so I'd always been my father's daughter, in that I was an observer. So I just fill my notebooks with thoughts and observations, and lo and behold, it was really a book in the making.
And you had done some magazine writing and some reporting, I believe, as well. You were kind of covering these incredible stories of other athletes accomplishing amazing. So was that writing experience different? Is kind of how you approached that magazine writing different from how you approached memoir writing?
Yes and no. I mean, I worked at Outside Magazine for 12 years on staff. I was the managing editor. I did many stories on assignment. But what I found, they're similar in that my approach to magazine writing and profile writing, which is really what I love to do in long form, is I would just immerse myself in my subject's world. So I would sort of disappear and I would be, immersed in their world. So whether it was spending a week in Yosemite with the late base jumper Dean Potter, kind of hanging out in his world, that's really my style. And so you have to bring a certain amount of heart, right? You want to let go of kind of this idea of what the story is, and that we have to manage the story and what's the angle. The story is really unfolding as you're experiencing it, and your job is just to capture it. You don't have to spin it or make it, like, at least in the kind of writing I like to do, which is really like, I want it to be true and factually true, but true to who the person is. And so I really use that approach with my own writing. It had to feel true. It had to be it had to be an actual expression of mine and who I was in order to work for me as a book.
Sure. And so I think, part of this book really is about the running and the physical aspects, but it's also a very deeply emotional book, and kind of it's almost a grief memoir too. Yeah. How did you kind of balance those two aspects of the book? And did you come away feeling, a little more healed after this writing process?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I felt healed from the writing and the running. But a lot of that happened before I really started the book. Started writing the manuscript. I had, again, like 3 or 4 years had passed. So I had, really processed a lot of that already. What's the first part of your question?
So my question was kind of about how, this book is deeply physical in all of the running that you're doing and talking about, but it's also deeply emotional. And so, there's sort of that physical prowess to it, but also that deeply emotional connection. I'm kind of wondering how you balanced those two pieces of it.
I knew that running, I always conceived of this as a memoir, a literary memoir about my relationship with my father. And then by extension, my relationship with myself as I learned who I was as a runner. So the running always felt like the vehicle through the story and the sort of energy moving the story. But first and foremost, I focused on my relationship with my father and what the grief, because it was such a profound experience losing him, and that it was the catalyst for the anxiety that followed and the, my decision to run farther and farther distances. So the running was the through line, and I just had to weave it through both. So I wanted to make sure the book was balanced between the father-daughter story and the running. And so it felt like when I was writing it at times, or rather when I was revising it maybe, that I was holders. Remember, if you did those as a kid and you did like the loop up and down, and then you have to do the other weave, and you want to make sure you bring each weave through all the way. And so that's really what I felt, is I want it to be an integrated whole balance between the two.
Well, I think you definitely accomplished that.
Thank you.
And I can't even imagine what it feels like to run an ultra marathon. That just seems like such a crazy feat to me. What was that experience like, and how did you keep pushing yourself physically through all of this? I know that, I'm sure a lot of it was very painful and there were injuries and things like that.
It's very much like living your life, and in that there's highs and lows. There's like the long sustained climbs. We're sort of in that right now as a society, right? It feels like we're never going to get to the top of the mountain and sail over the other side. It's just great practice for life because you always hit the wall. There's always a low point. I tell that to my daughters when we're out hiking in the mountains. If they're struggling, they're 10 and 12. I'm like, this is the low point. There will, you will move through it and get to the high point. And you just learn how to tolerate discomfort and uncertainty, which is, again, great practice for all of life. And so that's how it really, it was so natural for me to do the long distances because I needed to learn that. Like I had suffered this great loss and I was shaken to my core and I needed to build back my confidence, but also learn that the uncertainty is inevitable, right? We all think we have things nailed, or we did before the pandemic started, that we were in control. That's just an illusion. Like, we're really not. And if you lose someone you love, you realize that. And so ultra marathons, those long distances, anything from 30 miles to 100 miles, are filled with those moments of like, oh crap, like what did I get myself into? Or also like the soaring euphoric highs of like, oh my God, followed by the crushing lows. You just have to do what you do in real life, which is like keep eating, keep drinking, and get some rest and just like take care of yourself. And that's what ultra running taught me, was that I know how to take care of myself on the trail. And then that translates to real life. So it's a great symbiosis, and it also is really applicable to writing as well.
Yeah.
Right. Like when I came through the initial like grief triage period where I thought I was dying, and I was like, okay, now I'm kind of curious about my running stamina and how far can I really go. I also had this ulterior motive, which is that I wanted to write a book. I didn't know that I wanted to write a memoir. The memoir wasn't even in the picture. I wanted to write a novel, which I still do and will, but I wanted to write a novel. And so I was like, if I can teach myself how to run for 6 hours at a time, then surely I can teach myself to sit at my table, for 3 hours and write. And so I wanted to use running as training for writing, as funny as that sounds.
Yeah.
And yeah. And so you have those lows, and you also have that voice in your head that's like, shut up, you're so slow, like, what are you doing? Or with writing, like, God, everyone has, everyone's lost a family member or father. Like, why is your story special? And you have to hear those voices and then just show up anyway and be like, oh, I hear you. Same thing. If you listen to those voices as a runner, you'd probably never get out the door. And so it just builds up that stamina and that self-confidence that spills over into everything, parenting, writing, life. Yeah.
Yeah. So which do you find harder, running or writing?
Oh my gosh, it depends. Sometimes I use writing to aid my running. And sometimes, like right now, I'm working on my next book, and I really want my running to serve my writing. So when I run, it's all about like, I want to get into that sort of meditative state where I'm in that creative, imaginative place and my ideas are flowing. So it just depends. Sometimes the running is really effortless, and sometimes the writing is, and sometimes like they both are, and that's the dream place.
Yeah. Was there any one thing that really helped you in your writing? Was it, having your routine or the same place to write, or, is there one main thing that you would recommend to aspiring writers?
I write anywhere because I love to write, and I really take inspiration from the natural world. So I just will go outside anywhere with my notebook. I would say bring your notebook if you have a notebook, or something if you write on your phone, I don't know, but like always have it with you so that when you see something that inspires you, or you eavesdrop on that little conversation, like I can write a whole short story in my head on one line, overheard coffee shop. And so you want to be able to get those things down. So I always carry something to write with. And I always am that person who's like, wait, let me write this down, or keep it by the bed. But having a routine is great. Mine changes all the time because I have 2 kids and now I have a puppy. So like the routine out the window. But for me, movement is essential to my creative process. So moving my body in some way or another each day before I write, whether that's doing like a serious training run, those are great. But because I am now a serious competitive runner, they've lost a little bit of that like playfulness. And so a lot of times I'll just go, they have more of a purpose, like, oh, I've got to go run X miles at X pace or whatever. So have something in your back pocket that's just play and strictly fun and pleasure. And ideally it's movement. So for me, I like to just go hop on my bike and cruise around just in my tennis shoes. I'm not kitted out in any gear. I'm just riding my bike like I did when I was a kid. And that for me, when I move my body, I move my mind. And so that is essential. And so I do my best writing like after I've, been outside. And also for me, it needs to be outside if possible, the sun and fresh air. So yeah, that's essential to me. And I feel like it helps with everything, right? You get your endorphins going, your vitamin C, your mood boosting benefits, everything.
Definitely. Well, we're almost out of time, but I have two quick questions for you before we sign off. And so this book seems to be a lot about self-discovery, and I'm wondering if there's one big surprising that you learned about yourself throughout this whole process, be it the running or the writing, if there was just kind of one surprising thing that you discovered.
One surprising thing. I guess I learned I was capable of so much more than I thought. I mean, I've always been a runner, but not competitive. Like I didn't compete as a kid, which is kind of good. It saved running for me.
Yeah.
It stopped it from being this extrinsic goal. And it was this very personal, creative experience. And so when I started then competing as an adult, I learned that I was a lot faster than I realized and competitive, and that I had this really deep internal stamina that could keep me going. And so that was a really good discovery. And like I said, it translates to like anything you're going like the pandemic.
Yeah, a little stamina is good right now.
I know. Yeah.
And then my last question before I let you get back to the rest of your evening is if you have any other books that you would recommend to our followers.
Oh, that I'm reading? Okay, I just finished a great book called Migrations.
Oh, yeah.
Really great. I love books. I mostly read novels because I want to write. I mean, fiction is my dream to do. And I love stories with strong women who are kind of out in the world and in nature and doing wild things. And she, the main character is on a ship or on a small boat. She's tracking the last migration of the very last turns, Arctic turns from the Arctic to Antarctica. So some years in the future, though, probably not too many, when there are very, very few birds left in the world and very few fish in the oceans. And so it's this very moving story about both environmental catastrophe and this personal tragedy. I loved it.
Yeah, I've read that one too. I loved it as well.
I'm also reading Vesper Flights by Helen McDonald, which is also about birds.
Yeah.
And yeah, those are two of my more recent ones that I've loved. But I always have a book going, and I have a huge stack on my nightstand.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Katie. And I hope that all of you follow and pick up a copy of her memoir, now out in paperback, called Running Home.
Thank you. This has been really fun.
Oh, good. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Have a good night.
You as well.